Let's take a step back and look at the full picture here, because what is unfolding right now in the Strait of Hormuz is not just a military story, it is not just a geopolitical story, it is a story about who controls the arteries of the global economy and what happens when that control shifts hands in real time in front of the entire world. There is one point where Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is absolutely correct, and it deserves to be said clearly. This is an unjust war, an illegal war, a war that is producing consequences across the entire Western world that nobody fully anticipated and nobody has a clean answer for. And while the bombs and the missiles grab the headlines, the real battle, the one that will define the outcome of this conflict more than any airstrike, is happening in a narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman that most people couldn't point to on a map 3 months ago. Someone in the comments during our last transmission made an observation that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. They said the West is coming apart after just 25 days of a blockade at Hormuz. Cuba has been living under a US blockade for 67 years. 67 years. An illegal, arbitrary, economically devastating blockade that the United Nations General Assembly has voted unanimously, repeatedly to lift. And the country that presents itself to the world as the great defender of democracy, the guardian of international law, the protector of human rights, simply ignores that vote every single time. Cuba is still standing, the West is panicking after less than a month. That contrast should make every thinking person uncomfortable regardless of where they stand politically. And before we go any further, if this is the kind of analysis you're looking for, the kind that mainstream outlets consistently refuse to give you, then subscribe to From Report right now. Hit that button, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who's ready to look beyond the official narrative. We go live Monday through Friday, and we are not going anywhere. Now let's talk about the toll, because this is the development that changes everything, and it has not received nearly the coverage it deserves. Iran is now charging $2 million per vessel to cross the Strait of Hormuz, and they want that payment in Chinese yuan, not dollars yuan. A senior Iranian lawmaker, a member of the National Security Commission, not a minor political figure, not someone speaking off the record, confirmed this publicly this week. Within hours, the Iranian government issued a statement calling the claim unfounded, describing the lawmaker's comments as a personal opinion that does not represent official state policy. But here is what that same official denial also confirmed, buried in the diplomatic language. The strait is open selectively. It is open for Iran's allies, China, Russia, India, Turkey, Pakistan, and it is closed for the United States, Israel, and any nation aligned with them. Iran is the one making that determination. Iran is deciding ship by ship who gets through and who doesn't. Now you tell me, is that a denial, or is that a confession dressed up in careful wording? Because what Iran is describing is not a free and open international waterway. What Iran is describing is a checkpoint, a border crossing, a toll booth at the center of the global energy system. Whether the fee is officially $2 million per vessel, or whether it operates through selective access and political negotiation, the underlying reality is identical. Iran controls who moves oil through that strait, and right now Western nations cannot. To understand how extraordinary this moment is, we need to go back to where this all started. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran. We have covered the details of those strikes extensively on this channel, and we will continue to do so. What matters for today's conversation is what happened next. Before those strikes, the Strait of Hormuz was one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Approximately 130 vessels crossed it every single day. Tankers carrying crude oil, liquefied natural gas, container ships, bulk carriers, traffic moving in both directions around the clock without interruption. Iran did not interfere. The passage was, for all practical purposes, free. In the 26 days since the conflict began, fewer than 100 vessels have crossed in total. Let that number land for a moment. Before the war, 130 ships per day. Since the war began, fewer than 100 in nearly a month. That is a collapse of 95% of maritime traffic through a waterway responsible for moving 20% of the world's daily oil supply, 95%. And yet Donald Trump has stood in front of cameras and told the world that Iran's military has been destroyed, that the United States controls Iranian airspace, that Iran has been brought to its knees and is ready to negotiate. The Strait of Hormuz is his fact-checker, and it is not being kind to him. Stay with us on From Report, because we are going to keep pulling on every thread of this story. Subscribe now if you haven't already. This is only going to get more important in the days ahead. Let's talk about who is actually getting through, because the strait is not close to everyone, and that distinction matters enormously. India, China, Turkey and Pakistan are receiving selective passage. Countries that are not militarily aligned with Washington or Tel Aviv, countries that have maintained trade relationships with Tehran, countries that have either explicitly or implicitly refused to join the Western coalition against Iran. These nations are moving their ships through, their tankers are crossing, their energy supply, while disrupted, is not completely severed. Western vessels, European tankers, American-linked shipping, vessels flying the flags of U.S. allies are blocked. They cannot get through without Iranian authorization, and Iranian authorization at this moment is not forthcoming. What this means in practice is that Iran has effectively created a two-tier global energy market. There is the market for Iran's friends, where oil can still move, and there is the market for Iran's enemies, where it cannot. The geopolitical consequences of that division are still unfolding, but make no mistake, this is not a temporary disruption. This is a structural realignment of how energy power works in the 21st century, happening in real time. Now let's address the legal dimension, because it is more complicated than either side wants to admit. The Strait of Hormuz sits within the territorial waters of Iran and Oman under international maritime law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is classified as an international transit corridor. The convention states clearly that passage through such corridors must be free, continuous, and unobstructed. No nation may block it. No nation may charge for it. Here is the problem. Iran never ratified that convention. Neither did Israel, for that matter. So the legal framework that should govern this situation has no binding authority over the two parties at the very center of it. The law exists. The enforcement mechanism does not. And in the absence of enforcement, what fills the vacuum is power. Physical, military, economic power. And right now, in this specific waterway, Iran has it. There is also a layer of profound hypocrisy in the Western response that cannot go unrest. The same governments and media outlets that are expressing outrage at Iran's selective control of the strait have spent decades watching the United States decide unilaterally which countries can buy Venezuelan oil, which nations can trade with Cuba, which governments are permitted to do business with Iran itself. Washington has operated its own version of selective access to global markets for generations, not through military control of a waterway, but through sanctions, financial exclusion, and the threat of secondary penalties against any country that does business with the wrong partner. When the United States does it, it is called foreign policy. When Iran does it, it is called a violation of international norms. To be clear, and this matters, what Iran is doing is not without consequences and not without legitimate criticism. Closing or restricting a global shipping lane affects not just the countries Iran is targeting, it affects developing nations that have nothing to do with this conflict. It affects food supply chains, medicine, logistics, humanitarian aid. The people who suffer most from energy disruptions are rarely the ones making the decisions that cause them. That is true when Washington imposes sanctions. It is equally true when Tehran closes strait. But intellectual honesty requires us to hold both of those truths simultaneously, and that is what we do here on From Report every single day. Subscribe, share this video, and be part of a community that demands that standard from its news sources. Let's talk about the nuclear pretext, because it is falling apart in plain sight. This war was justified to the public, at least in part, on the basis of Iran's alleged pursuit of nuclear weapons. The same framework, the same language, the same intelligence community says narrative that was used to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We know how that ended. Here is what we also know. A former senior U.S. counterterrorism official has publicly acknowledged something that should be central to any honest discussion of this conflict. There exists a religious edict, a fatwa issued by Iran's supreme religious authority that explicitly and categorically prohibits the development of nuclear weapons. That fatwa is still in force. Iran is a theocratic state, and within that system a fatwa of that nature carries the highest possible religious authority. It is not a political statement that can be walked back by a new administration. It is a binding religious ruling. Meanwhile, Israel, a country that has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that has never submitted to international inspections, that has never publicly acknowledged its nuclear arsenal, despite that arsenal being one of the worst-kept secrets in global security, faces zero meaningful pressure from Washington to dismantle anything. Israel can build as many warheads as it chooses. Iran cannot build one without triggering an international military response. The inconsistency is not a matter of interpretation. It is a documented, observable double standard. And the fact that this war is now openly about control of the Strait of Hormuz rather than nuclear non-proliferation tells you everything you need to know about what the actual objectives were from the beginning. Now let's get to the ultimatum, because this is where the gap between Trump's rhetoric and ground reality becomes impossible to ignore. Several days ago, Trump issued a public ultimatum to Iran: open the strait completely within 48 hours or face consequences. Iran's response was immediate and unambiguous. They ignored the ultimatum entirely, and they issued a counter-threat of their own. If the United States or Israel strikes Iranian nuclear facilities, Iran will close the strait completely, not partially, not selectively, but totally, and will simultaneously launch massive strikes against power plants and desalination infrastructure across the Middle East. Desalination infrastructure, think about what that means. Several Gulf states, countries that are nominally U.S. allies in this region, depend on desalinated water for the majority of their freshwater supply. Iran is not just threatening to cut off oil, it is threatening to cut off water. That is an escalation ladder that goes to places nobody in Washington appears to have fully gamed out. On the military side, the U.S. is running operations, low-altitude jets, Apache helicopters, A-10 Warthogs flying along the Iranian coastline, targeting fast boats and drone launch infrastructure. These operations are real, they are ongoing, and they are doing damage, but they are slow. They are methodical, and they do not guarantee control of the strait. You cannot bomb your way to freedom of navigation through a waterway that the other side controls from its own coastline, using weapons that cost a fraction of the assets being deployed against them. On the diplomatic side, the situation has moved beyond complicated into something closer to surreal. Trump has described productive conversations with Iranian officials. Iran has stated flatly and publicly that no such conversations are taking place and that they have no interest in having them. There is one party describing a partnership. The other party says that partner does not exist. Somewhere in that gap between those two versions of reality, actual policy is being made, and that should alarm everyone. Here is what I want you to pay close attention to, because it signals something important about how Iran is thinking beyond the immediate fighting. Iran's foreign minister in recent days raised the concept of new arrangements for the Strait of Hormuz after the war ends. He spoke of a framework that would account for Iranian interests and for the broader interests of the region. He did not describe a return to the pre-war status quo. He described something new, something designed, something that would be negotiated from a position of demonstrated power. This is not the language of a country that believes it is losing. This is the language of a country that believes it has already won the argument about who controls the strait and is now beginning to think about how to formalize that control once the shooting stops. Iran's economy was in serious difficulty before the first bomb fell. After this war, reconstruction will be a generational project. They are going to need revenue, leverage, and international recognition. The Strait of Hormuz gives them all three if they play it correctly. The unofficial toll proposal denied at the government level, but promoted by senior legislators with security clearances, is one option on that table. Selective access agreements with friendly nations are another. A formal multilateral framework that embeds Iranian oversight into the governance of the strait is a third. None of these outcomes were on the table 6 months ago. All of them are being discussed today. That is a measure of how much has changed. Let me leave you with the observation that I think puts everything in the clearest possible context. Not a single major Western nation is standing behind this war. Not Germany, not France, not Italy, not Spain, whose Prime Minister called it unjust and illegal in terms that left no room for diplomatic ambiguity. Not a single country with genuine international standing has been willing to put its name on what is happening. The coalition that launched this conflict is a coalition of two, and one of those two is now ordering the evacuation of its civilians from a neighboring country that it spent 20 years and $1 trillion trying to turn into an ally. India and China, both of whom have enormous economic stakes tied to Iranian trade and Gulf energy, are watching with deep unease. Not because they want to pay $2 million per vessel to move their oil, but because no serious nation, regardless of its relationship with Tehran, wants a permanent precedent where a single country holds veto power over a global shipping lane. That precedent cuts both ways. Today it is Iran at Hormuz. Tomorrow it could be someone else somewhere else. The rules that govern international waterways exist precisely to prevent that kind of leverage from becoming normalized. But here is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath all of this. Those rules only function when the powerful nations that claim to uphold them actually uphold them consistently. When the United States sanctions countries into economic collapse, when it decides unilaterally who can and cannot participate in global trade, when it invades countries on the basis of intelligence that later proves to be fabricated, it does not just break individual rules, it breaks the credibility of the entire system. And when that system loses credibility, what replaces it is exactly what we are watching right now: raw power. Whoever controls the choke point makes the rules. Iran did not invent that logic. It learned it. We are going to keep following every dimension of this story on From Report. The military developments, the energy markets, the diplomatic maneuvering, and the long-term structural shifts that most outlets are not even beginning to cover. If this analysis is valuable to you, the single most important thing you can do right now is subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone in your life who is trying to make sense of what is happening in the world, and join us live Monday through Friday, where we go deeper on all of it. The mainstream media will give you the official version. We will give you the full picture. We'll see you in the next